Somewhere in 9th century China, a man singed his beard off trying to live forever. That is not a joke. That is the actual origin story of the most consequential weapon in human history. The man was a Taoist alchemist, not a soldier, not a weapons designer. He and his colleagues had spent years mixing saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur in whatever proportions ancient recipes suggested, heating the mixture carefully over open flame, searching for the right combination. One afternoon, they found something else entirely. The workshop caught fire. The Chinese texts that survived describe the scene with careful, slightly embarrassed detail. Singed beards, burned hands, workshops reduced to ash. The substance these alchemists had created was volatile, unpredictable, and absolutely nothing like an immortality elixir. They called it Huo Yao, fire medicine, a name that still carries the faint memory of its original purpose. That quiet suggestion that someone genuinely believed this explosive powder might one day be good for you. Here is the part nobody tells you. That discovery did not immediately become a weapon. It took more than 200 years before anyone pointed it at another human being. And the path from that first singed beard to the modern firearm passed through bamboo tubes, bronze cylinders, and Mongol military campaigns spanning an entire continent. Every single step was driven not by genius, but by one specific practical problem that the previous version had failed to solve. Start with the chemistry, because understanding what gunpowder actually is explains everything that followed. The mixture combined potassium nitrate, known as saltpeter, with charcoal and sulfur in roughly a 75 to 15 to 10 ratio by weight. Saltpeter functions as an oxidizer, releasing oxygen rapidly when heated and feeding an extremely fast combustion reaction that produces a sudden, violent expansion of gas. That expanding gas is the entire mechanical secret behind everything gunpowder would ever be used for, whether that meant launching fireworks into a festival sky or, 6 centuries later, launching a metal ball through a knight's plate armor at a range that made the armor completely irrelevant. In its earliest documented uses, gunpowder was not weaponized at all. Chinese engineers used it for fireworks and festival ceremony. For generations, ordinary people encountered it as spectacle, something that lit up the night sky, something with nothing to do with killing. That changed once Song Dynasty military commanders paid close attention to what this material actually did when properly contained. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, Chinese engineers developed the Huo Qiang, or fire lance. The design was almost laughably simple. Take a length of bamboo, strap it to a spear, pack it with gunpowder, light it during close combat. The result was a weapon that spewed flame and burning debris at anyone within arm's reach, turning an ordinary spear into something no soldier had ever been trained to face. Defenders used fire lances during the siege of Dian in 1132 against forces scaling their walls. The weapon worked. But according to military historian Kelly DeVries, the psychological impact mattered as much as the physical damage. These were soldiers trained to face blades and arrows. Flame projected outward from a weapon was something their minds had no framework for. That kind of shock often mattered as much on a medieval battlefield as the actual injury inflicted. Once gunpowder had proven itself in combat, the refinements came quickly. Each one followed an obvious next step from whatever came before. Makers of fire lances began stuffing ceramic pellets and pottery shards into the bamboo tubes alongside the powder. Small adjustment, massive conceptual leap. The weapon had shifted from something that burned to something that flung solid objects outward with penetrating force. That is the foundational idea behind every firearm that would ever follow. The tube, the propellant, the projectile. Everything else in this story is a refinement of those three things. The bamboo itself was the next problem. It could not handle stronger charges without splitting apart, injuring the soldier holding it rather than the enemy facing him. When Chinese craftsmen learned to cast bronze tubes strong enough to contain that pressure, the hand cannon was born. By the 13th century, metal-barreled hand cannons were in regular use across China, alongside scaled-up weapons, with names that told you everything about the impression they made. The thunderclap bomb, the heaven-shaking cannon, and then the Mongols arrived. When Mongol armies invaded China in the 1200s, they encountered these weapons firsthand during the defense of Kaifeng in 1232. Rather than being stopped by the new technology, the Mongols absorbed it entirely and carried it westward into Central Asia and toward the Islamic world. Historian Joseph Needham argued that Mongol military campaigns functioned almost like an accidental delivery system for Chinese technology. Gunpowder knowledge crossed enormous distances far faster than trade caravans alone ever could have managed, spreading across Eurasia within just a few generations. Paper, printing, and the magnetic compass made the same journey during roughly the same centuries, part of a larger flow of knowledge moving from east to west long before anyone coined the word globalization. By the late 13th century, gunpowder technology had reached Europe, and the military landscape it landed in it would, over the following centuries, completely transform. Early European hand cannons were crude and slow to reload. You packed powder and a ball into the open end, touched a smoldering ember to a touch hole, and hoped the explosion sent the projectile somewhere useful. But even in this primitive form, the consequences were enormous. Castle walls that had withstood siege equipment for generations began falling to cannon fire. The mounted knight in heavy plate armor, dominant across medieval Europe for centuries, found himself vulnerable to a weapon that did not care how much steel he was wearing. The social order built around armored cavalry began to collapse. A cheap weapon in the hands of a minimally trained soldier could neutralize an opponent who had spent a lifetime preparing for traditional combat. As cannons grew more powerful, tall stone castle walls became dangerously obsolete. Military engineers responded with the Star Fort and the Bastion, lower and angled and heavily reinforced, designed to deflect cannon fire. The medieval castle was replaced by structures that looked almost nothing like it, all because of a weapon that began half a world away as a failed potion. The next transformative development was the matchlock mechanism, arriving in the late 15th century. And this single innovation is what finally turned gunpowder weapons from clumsy novelties into the true backbone of organized infantry warfare. The problem with early hand cannons was coordination. One hand to steady the weapon, the other to apply a burning ember to the touch hole, all while trying to aim at a moving target. The matchlock solved this by attaching a slow-burning cord held in a clamp called a serpentine directly to the weapon. Pulling a trigger lowered the burning cord into a pan of priming powder, igniting the charge automatically and freeing both hands to aim properly. This was the first mechanical firing device ever applied to a small arm. For the first time in history, a single soldier could fire a gunpowder weapon with real precision. By the early 16th century, matchlock arquebuses were spreading across Europe. The Ottoman Empire incorporated them into the elite Janissary Corps. In 1543, Portuguese traders brought matchlock technology to Japan, where local gunsmiths refined the design so thoroughly that Japanese matchlocks, known as Tanegashima, were regarded as among the finest crafted firearms in the world. China, having started this entire chain centuries earlier, ended up reabsorbing an improved version of its own invention to counter Mongol incursions along its northern frontier. A fitting historical loop. The matchlock's weakness was its open flame, nearly useless in rain, visible in darkness, requiring constant management even on a quiet battlefield. The wheel lock, developed in the early 16th century, used a spring-loaded wheel spinning against pyrite to generate sparks without any burning cord, making it practical for cavalry. But its mechanical complexity kept it expensive and out of reach for ordinary infantry. The true breakthrough was the flintlock, credited to French gunsmith Marin le Bourgeois around 1610. A spring-loaded hammer holding a piece of flint struck a steel surface called a frizzen, generating sparks directly into the priming pan. No open flame required at all. Faster to operate. Dramatically more reliable in wet conditions. No position betrayed in darkness. By the 1630s, the flintlock dominated European armies. It held that position for roughly 2 centuries, right through the Napoleonic Wars and the American Revolution, where flintlock muskets carried by both colonial